I wanted to do this in Rabbi Friedman's presence, and so perhaps I'll be able to do that a little bit later. But I specifically wanted, in some ways, to be able to present here because of the wonderful relationship that we've had over the last few years with Ariel, and the opportunity to be here and to spend Shabbos here, and in many other ways to receive the support, so to speak, of the community. And so it's an honor to be here, even though I sense that a number of people are not from here. But either way, it is nonetheless nice to be here, and looking forward to tonight's presentation. Now, I will preface my remarks by saying it's not the kind of presentation that we, in many ways, look forward to, because of the fact that it's a topic that we're not so excited about. We're talking about the Churban, the destruction of the Bayis Hamikdash. And, but at the same time, I think that we often lack a real meaningful understanding of what actually occurred. Now, you are supposed to get handouts that look like this. Again, not everything was arranged the way I understood. That is a work in progress. Hopefully that will happen sooner than later. But there were some other technicalities that we had to work out. So in the meantime, please bear with me. There are going to be some maps anyway that we're going to be looking at that you did not have or would not have in the handout. So regardless, I think we can get started. And so we're going to begin tonight with a talk about Churban Bayis Rishon, the destruction of the first temple. And next week we're going to talk about the destruction of the second Bayis Hamikdash, the second temple, which took place roughly 500 years after the destruction of the first. Okay, now a couple of housekeeping items before we begin. I think it's important for us to know a little bit about chronicling, dating associated with this period of time. You might be aware this will not, what I'm sharing with you now, will not impact our conversation next week. Okay, so next week, when we're talking about the destruction of the second Bayis Hamikdash at the hands of the Romans, by then it seems that all of history sort of has worked itself out. But if you're a student of Jewish history at all, you might be aware that there is a discrepancy of approximately 160 years that separates the calculations of what we call maybe Chazal or sacred historians, as opposed to perhaps secular historians. And the main difference between the two lies with the Persian period. So the length of the Babylonian period and the Assyrian period that comes before, we're going to talk about all of that. That seems to be relatively aligned, but the length of the Babylonian period is much shorter, according to Jewish history, than it is according to secular historians. The number of kings that are the Persian kings at that particular time, according to us, I think the Persian era ran about 50 years, whereas according to secular historians, about 200 years. So that's going to automatically place a huge discrepancy between the two dating systems. And so you'll see some numbers where I put one number followed by a second number. The first number is secular history, and the second number is, so to speak, Jewish history. At least, again, the way our sages, the way Chazal present the figures. Okay? And that's just important for you to be aware of. So, for example, the year that is given to the destruction of the first Bayis Hamikdash, if you check any, let's call it secular history book, you will see that the first Bayis Hamikdash was destroyed in the year 586. According to our records, it took place in the year, I believe, 423, I think is the number. We'll see that soon. Okay, that's an example of a significant discrepancy between the two. And so you see that consistently presented throughout the presentation. Another thing that's going to distinguish the first lecture, if you will, from next week's is geographically. We're going to look at some maps, but the trouble, so to speak, in this period comes from the east. So if you're familiar, if you can kind of map out in your mind before we look at some maps together, you're talking about Assyria and then Babylonia. Both of them are in modern-day Iraq. Modern-day Iraq, as we know, sits to the east of Eretz Yisrael. In fact, the Gemara refers to the land of Israel as Ma'arava. Ma'arava means to the west, because again, from their perspective. So if you are an Ashkenazic Jew, and you have lived for centuries in Ashkenazic lands, whether that be in Europe and then here in America, you typically think of Israel as Mizrach. That's the normal way we associate with the land of Israel. However, if you're South African, you think of Eretz Yisrael as to the north. And if you are from, let's say, certain areas of Russia or let's say Lebanon and further areas that way, you think of Eretz Yisrael to the south. It's all relative, and the Gemara in Brachos talks about that. The second Beis HaMikdash was destroyed at the hands of the Romans. The Romans, of course, lived in Italy, and Italy is to the west. So it's coming from a different space geographically. It's also coming over a period of stages, if you will. Okay, Churban Bayis Rishon really is the culmination of a lot of destruction and exile. A lot of destruction and exile. Really, if you go back, and this is, I guess, how we can begin, assuming that I have this going through. Okay, I already got it. So we have over here, I'm sorry, it seems to be slightly off, but the destruction of the southern kingdom, and I'm going to talk about this more in a moment, took place about 135 years after the exile of the remaining northern tribes. So I'm sure everybody here is familiar with the idea that we lost the 10 tribes, the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Okay, and it's a whole debate, so to speak, amongst Chazal, what exactly happened to them and what exactly will possibly happen to them. We talk about Uva Ovdim, Eretz Ashur, the lost ones from the land of Ashur, popularized by Shlomo Carlebach, one of his songs. But it's a question in and of itself as to what actually happened to them. And generally speaking, we assume that they became fully assimilated. Okay, they were by and large lost, literally. And there are questions, have any retained traditions? And there are others, as we know, who have historically claimed to be from the 10 tribes, including some African groups that have emerged more recently. Okay, that have some kind of connection to Yiddishkeit, but even there it wasn't so simple, and there's a whole Gerus process necessary. So the northern kingdom, which we call the Malchus of Yisrael, is the Israelite kingdom.